The rawhide was stretched so tight over the cartonwood frame it hummed when a fly landed on the swell. Lynn traced the line of sinew stitching, a perfect, unwavering seam that had taken her 3 days to complete. It was good work. Her late husband, Wei, had taught her well, passing on the knowledge he'd learned from a Cheyenne man beside the railroad tracks, a world away from the coast and the life they'd been promised. The saddle was her only currency now, the last echo of that life. It was all she had to offer the dusty, sun-bleached town of Redemption Creek, Nevada, in the summer of 1878. She stood before the counter of Thorne's Mercantile, the saddle resting on the worn plank floor between her feet. The air in the store was thick with the smell of coffee beans, cured tobacco, and the sharp scent of lye soap. It was a smell of commerce, of things being bought and sold, a world she felt entirely outside of. Her dress, a simple white prairie gown from a time when her future held more promise, was now thin at the elbows and bore a faint, stubborn stain near the hem. It felt like a costume for a part she no longer played. Marcus Thorne looked down at the saddle, then at her, his eyes lingering for a moment on the fraying cuffs of her sleeves. He was a man whose softness was a kind of armor, his clean shirt and manicured nails a statement of his remove from the grit and labor that defined everyone else in town. He nudged the saddle with the polished toe of his boot. "Unusual," he said, the word hanging in the air like dust motes. "The tooling is rustic." He did not mean it as a compliment. "And the design. It's not what folks are accustomed to. Too much like the saddles the Paiute ride." Lynn's hands tightened into fists at her sides. She kept her voice steady, low. "It is a good saddle. Strong frame. The leather is sound." She had spent her last coins on that leather, trading for it from a passing freighter who didn't ask questions. "Perhaps," Thorne allowed, a thin smile playing on his lips. He enjoyed this part. The negotiation. The slow, deliberate grinding down of a person's hope. "But what's it worth? To me, it's just inventory that will sit here gathering dust. I'm a businessman, not a collector of curiosities." He named a price, a number so small it was a calculated insult. It was barely enough for a week's worth of flour and beans. A cold knot formed in Lynn's stomach. She had expected him to offer low, but this was cruel. She opened her mouth to argue, to defend the hours of work, the precision of the stitching, the balance of the piece, but the words wouldn't come. In this town, her voice was not worth the air it displaced. She was a Chinese widow, a ghost at the edge of the community, and they both knew it. The bell over the door chimed, and a gust of hot, dry air swept into the store. A man stepped inside, bringing the scent of sagebrush and horse with him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by sun and wind into a mask of quiet severity. Dust coated his boots and the brim of his hat. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, his eyes taking in the entire room before settling on the counter. This was Silas Vance. A man who owned the sprawling ranch west of town and spoke to almost no one. He nodded once at Thorne, a curt gesture of acknowledgement, and then his gaze fell to the saddle on the floor. He stopped. Lynn watched as he crouched down, not with the condescending poke of Thorne's boot, but with a genuine interest. He ran a calloused thumb over the seat, testing the grain of the leather. His fingers traced the intricate stitching along the cantle, feeling the rhythm of the work. He looked at the way the stirrup leathers were attached, a method Way had insisted was stronger than any other. He saw things Thorne had either missed or chosen to ignore. He looked up, not at Thorne, but directly at Lynn. His eyes were a startlingly clear gray, and they held no pity, only a quiet, assessing focus. "You make this?" he asked. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, but it was a straightforward question. Lynn swallowed past the lump in her throat. "Yes." He stood up, his height seeming to shrink the already cluttered store. He turned to Thorne. "What did you offer her for it?" Thorne's polite facade tightened. He disliked being challenged, especially by a man like Vance who operated outside the town's careful social order. "That is a private matter between myself and the lady." Silas Vance's expression didn't change, but a new stillness came over him. "She's not selling it to you," he stated, not as a suggestion, but as a fact. He looked back at Lynn. What's your price? For a moment, she was too stunned to speak. No one had asked her that. No one had looked at her as if her valuation of her own work mattered. She remembered the number she and Wei had once agreed was fair for such a piece, a number that had felt like a dream just minutes ago. She said it aloud. A faint, surprised sound, like a choked laugh, escaped Thorn. That's absurd. For that thing? Silas ignored him completely. He reached into his worn trousers and pulled out a small leather pouch. He untied the drawstring and tipped a cascade of silver coins onto the counter. The sound was a sharp, clean rebuke to Thorn's disdain. He counted out the exact amount Lin had named, his movements unhurried. He pushed the stack of coins across the counter toward her. There, he said. He then turned his grey eyes on Thorn. Put the saddle on my account. She takes the cash. Thorn's face was a mixture of fury and disbelief. He was being overruled in his own establishment. But Silas Vance's money was as good as anyone's, and there was a look in the rancher's eyes that discouraged argument. Silas tipped his hat to Lin. You make another one. She could only nod, her hand hovering over the silver coins, so bright and solid on the dark wood. When it's done, bring it to my ranch. West Road, 3 miles out. The gate has a V burned into the post. He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked out of the store, the bell chiming his departure. Lin stood frozen for a long moment, the silence in the store ringing in her ears. She slowly, carefully, swept the coins into her small purse. She did not look at Marcus Thorn as she picked up her now empty flour sack and walked out, but she could feel the heat of his glare on her back. Outside, the sun was blindingly bright, but for the first time in months, the world did not seem entirely dark. She had money for food and leather, but she also had a powerful new enemy, and an encounter with a silent stranger that she could not begin to understand. The silver coins from Silas Vance felt heavy in her pocket, a tangible weight against the uncertainty of her new situation. They bought her flour, salt pork, and, most importantly, a new side of quality leather from a traveling merchant, avoiding another confrontation with Thorn. But the money also drew a line in the sand. In a town as small as Redemption Creek, an act of defiance, no matter how quiet, did not go unnoticed. Marcus Thorn was a man who understood power not in terms of brute force, but as a web of obligations and dependencies. He owned the only mercantile, operated the only freight office, and held the notes on half the homesteads in the valley. He could not abide someone operating outside his influence. Lin's direct sale to Vance was a tear in that web. He began subtly. A word here, a question there. Strange saddle that Chinese woman is making, isn't it? Heard Vance bought it. Hope his horse doesn't mind that Indian rig. He planted seeds of doubt about the quality of her work, leveraging the town's inherent suspicion of anything, or anyone, unfamiliar. When men gathered in his store, he'd shake his head with faux concern. A man needs a reliable saddle. Can't be too careful. Lin felt the change in the air. The few people who had previously offered a hesitant nod now looked straight through her. When she walked down the main street, conversations would quiet until she passed. She was more isolated than ever, a pariah by association. The real trouble began when she ran out of the thick, waxed linen thread she used for the main seams. It was a specific kind, strong enough to hold against the constant strain of a rider's weight. The traveling merchant didn't have any. Thorn's mercantile was the only place left. Taking a deep breath, she walked back into the store, the bell above the door sounding like a judgment. The store was busy this time. 2 ranchers were discussing the price of beef by the pickle barrel, and a blacksmith's wife was examining bolts of calico. Thorn was behind the counter, polishing a set of scales. He saw her enter, and a slow, satisfied smile touched his lips. Lin walked to the counter, keeping her eyes fixed on the shelf behind him where the spools of thread were kept. I need a spool of your heaviest waxed linen thread, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Thorn continued polishing, his movements deliberate. Do you now? He asked, not looking at her. Can't say we have what you're looking for. Lin's eyes darted to the shelf. She could see it. 3 spools of the exact thread she needed, sitting right behind a jar of licorice. "It's right there," she pointed. "The dark brown one." Now he looked at her, his expression one of feigned surprise. "Oh, that's reserved. Special order for Mr. Abernathy's harness repair." The other customers had stopped their conversations. They were watching, listening. Lynn could feel their eyes on her. The blacksmith's wife shifted uncomfortably. Humiliation washed over Lynn, hot and sickening. It was a lie, a public dismissal designed to put her in her place. "I will pay double," she said, the words tasting like ash. Desperation made her bold. Thorne laughed, a soft, unpleasant sound. "My dear woman, it's not a matter of money. It's a matter of supply. We simply don't have any for general sales." He let the implication hang in the air. "Not for her." The bell on the door chimed again. It was Silas Vance. He moved through the silent store like a shadow, his presence immediately shifting the room's tense atmosphere. He walked to the counter and placed a short list of supplies on the wood. He seemed not to notice the scene he had interrupted. Thorne's smile faltered. He turned to Silas, his professional courtesy snapping back into place. "Mr. Vance, what can I get for you?" Silas looked at his list, then glanced at the shelf behind Thorne. "Add a spool of your thickest waxed linen thread to that. The kind for leatherwork." The store was utterly silent. Thorne's face went pale. He was trapped. To refuse Vance would be to lose the business of the largest ranch in the county. To sell it to him would be to admit his lie in front of half the town. He stared at Silas for a long moment, searching for a way out, but the rancher's gray eyes were flat and unreadable. Defeated, Thorne turned, grabbed one of the spools, and placed it on the counter with a thud. He gathered the rest of Silas's order in resentful silence. Silas paid in coin, his movements as methodical as ever. He picked up his canvas sack of goods and the spool of thread. He walked out of the store without a word. Lynn, knowing the scene was over, turned and followed him out into the glaring sun. She caught up to him as he was untying his horse from the hitching post. He turned and held out the spool of thread. "This should get you started on the next one," he said. Her hand trembled slightly as she took it. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will pay you back." "Just make a good saddle," he replied. He swung himself up onto his horse, a powerful bay that watched her with intelligent eyes. He looked down at her for a moment. "Don't let a man like Thorne decide what you're worth." He nudged his horse into a walk and rode out of town, leaving Lynn standing in the dusty street, the spool of thread feeling like a lifeline in her hand. The town had witnessed the exchange. Silas Vance had publicly chosen a side. And Lynn knew, as she walked back to her small shack on the edge of town, that she was no longer just building a saddle. She was building a defense. She worked with a feverish intensity, fueled by a mix of gratitude and defiance. The small shack she lived in became a workshop, the air thick with the scent of leather and beeswax. She worked from sunup to sundown, her hands growing raw, her muscles aching. The saddle took shape under her skilled fingers, the seat carefully molded, the fenders cut with precision, the intricate stamping a pattern of her own design, a subtle blend of tradition and innovation. When it was finally done, it was better than the first. It was a statement. She borrowed a neighbor's placid mule. The man was a railroad worker who spoke little English but understood the language of hard work, and set out for Silas Vance's ranch. The road was little more than a pair of ruts winding through sagebrush and rock. The V burned into the gatepost was stark and clear. The ranch beyond was vast, the landscape beautiful but unforgiving. The house was simple, a sturdy clapboard structure that seemed to brace itself against the wind. But as she drew closer, she saw signs of a place run by one person doing the work of 3. The section of fence was mended with wire instead of proper rails, the vegetable garden was overgrown with weeds, and a lone windmill turned with a rhythmic, mournful squeak. There was no sign of Silas near the house. A horse whinnied from the large barn, a sound of distress. Lynn slid off the mule, tied it to a post, and, carrying the new saddle, walked toward the barn's wide-open doors. Inside, the light was dim and smelled of hay and liniment. Silas was there, his back to her. He was bent over a beautiful sorrel mare, whose leg was wrapped in bloody bandages. He was speaking to the animal in a low, soothing murmur, his hands moving with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. He worked with a focused calm, cleaning the wound, his movements precise and economical. He wasn't just a rancher tending to his stock. The way he worked on the horse, with such delicate expertise, was with the sure, knowing hands of a doctor. He seemed to sense her presence and looked over his shoulder. His face was grim, etched with worry for the animal. "She tangled with a barbed wire fence," he said, his voice tight. "Tore her up badly." Lynn placed the saddle carefully on a clean bale of hay. She approached the horse slowly, making soft, calming sounds. The mare's eyes were wide with pain, but she didn't shy away. Lynn reached out and stroked the horse's neck, feeling the tremor of fear and pain run through the powerful animal. "I can help," she said quietly. "My father, back home, he taught me about herbs for wounds." Silas watched her for a moment, his gray eyes searching her face. Then he nodded. "There's a clean bucket by the pump. And a box of medical supplies in the tack room. Anything you need." For the next hour, they worked together in the quiet of the barn. Lynn cleaned the wound with a solution of carbolic acid from his kit, her touch as gentle as his. He held the mare steady, his strength a comforting presence for the frightened animal. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, two people fluent in the language of patient, necessary work. When the leg was cleaned and rebandaged, the mare finally seemed to relax, resting her weight on her good legs. Silas gave her a final pat on the neck and turned to Lynn. A line of tension in his jaw had eased. "Thank you," he said. It sounded like more than just gratitude for her help with the horse. He finally turned his attention to the saddle she had brought. He walked over to it, running his hands over it just as he had in the store. He tested the stitching, checked the balance, and nodded slowly. "It's good work. Better than the first." "The thread you bought me is strong," she replied. A rare, faint smile touched his lips. He looked around the dusty, quiet barn, at the empty stalls and the mended tools hanging on the walls. My wife, Sarah, she admired people who could make things. Real things. With their hands. The words came out with a quiet difficulty, as if he hadn't spoken her name aloud in a long time. It was the first time he had ever mentioned a wife. He walked over to an old wooden chest in the corner and lifted the lid. He took out a small, leather-bound book. She was a quilter, he said, holding the book in his large hands. She could take scraps of nothing and make something beautiful. Something that would keep a person warm. He didn't offer the book to her, but he opened it to a page where a delicate, purple wildflower was pressed between the pages of elegant script. She saw the good in things most folks just walk right past. He closed the book gently and placed it back in the chest. "When I saw your saddle in Thorne's store, I saw that same thing. Honest work. Something made to last." In that moment, Lynn understood. It hadn't been pity that made him help her. It was a deep, abiding respect for the work itself, a respect born from love and loss. A connection that went deeper than words. Their quiet understanding was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Two riders came to a stop outside the barn. One was the U.S. Marshal from Carson City, his badge glinting in the sunlight. The other was Marcus Thorne, a look of smug triumph on his face. The marshal dismounted, his expression serious. He held a rolled-up piece of paper in his hand. "Silas Vance?" he asked, his voice carrying an official weight. Silas stepped out of the barn to meet him, his face becoming a stony mask once more. Lynn followed, her heart pounding. "I'm Vance," Silas said. The marshal unrolled the paper. It was a wanted poster. He held it up. The sketch was crude, but the resemblance was undeniable. "I have a warrant for a man named Silas Kane. Wanted in Missouri for practicing medicine without a license. It says here he's a former doctor, stripped of his credentials. Mr. Thorne here believes you're that man." Thorne's smile was venomous. He fits the description perfectly, Marshal. A man with medical knowledge, hiding out here on his own. The Marshal looked from the poster to Silas, his gaze sharp and assessing. What do you have to say for yourself? Silas looked at the poster, at Thorne's triumphant face, and then at Lynn. He drew a slow breath. My name is Silas Kane, he said, his voice low but clear. I was a doctor. Thorne's victory seemed complete. The Marshal took a step forward, reaching for a pair of handcuffs on his belt. But before he could move, Lynn stepped forward, placing herself between him and Silas. This man saved my husband's life, she said, her voice ringing with a conviction she didn't know she possessed. The lie came to her in a flash, a shield forged from desperation and a fierce, sudden loyalty. Last winter, at the railroad camp. There was lung fever. He treated my way and half the other men, and he never asked for a single coin. He is the only doctor these people have, license or not. The Marshal stopped, surprised by her fierce defense. He looked at her, then back at Silas, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Thorne scoffed. She's lying to protect him. Her husband died in a rockslide months ago. He treated him before that, Lynn insisted, meeting the Marshal's gaze without flinching. Ask anyone from the camps. Ask them who they turn to when a man is hurt or a fever takes hold. It isn't Mr. Thorne in his fine store. It's him. She had no idea if anyone would back her story, but she had seen the respect in the railroad worker's eyes when he'd lent her his mule. She was betting on the quiet, unseen web of gratitude that Silas had woven, a web far stronger than Thorne's network of debt and fear. She had made her choice. She had stood with the outcast, and now, whatever happened to him would happen to her as well. 6 months later, a heavy snow blanketed the valley, muffling the world in a deep and profound silence. The wind that whipped across the plains found no purchase on the sturdy new workshop that stood beside Silas Kane's barn. Inside, the air was warm from a pot-bellied stove and rich with the smell of leather and wood smoke. Lynn sat at her workbench, her ledger open before her. It was filled with names and orders from as far away as the Wyoming Territory. She was no longer just making saddles, she was running a business. The U.S. Marshal, a man named Dawson, had been more thorough than Thorne had anticipated. He had indeed ridden out to the railroad camps and the scattered mining operations in the hills. He discovered that Lynn's specific story about her husband was untrue, but its spirit was not. He found a dozen men who swore Dr. Kane had set their broken bones, stitched their wounds, or dosed their fevers, all without asking for payment. He had earned a loyalty that money could not buy. Faced with the Marshal's report and a petition signed by nearly every homesteader and laborer in the county, the territorial judge in Carson City had been pragmatic. Hanging or jailing the only doctor within a 100-mile radius on the cusp of winter seemed a foolish waste. He levied a heavy fine against Silas for the unlicensed practice, a sum that was quietly and quickly paid by a collection taken up by the very people he had treated. The official charge was dismissed. Silas Kane was free to ranch, and if he happened to provide medical care to his neighbors, the law would look the other way. Thorne's victory had turned to ash in his mouth. In his attempt to ruin Silas, he had exposed his own vindictive nature to the entire community. People began to find reasons to avoid his store. A new freight service, organized by Lynn and funded by Silas, began making weekly runs to Carson City, bringing back supplies at a fairer price. Thorne's web of control was unraveling, thread by thread. The squeak of the back door opening pulled Lynn from her ledger. Silas came in, stamping snow from his boots. He carried his medical bag, his face ruddy from the cold. He'd just returned from the Abernathy homestead, where he'd set their youngest adult son's broken arm. He'll be fine, Silas said, answering her unasked question. Stubborn as his father, but the bone set clean, he placed his bag on a small table and came to stand behind her, looking over her shoulder at the neat columns in the ledger. Another order from the foreman at the Silver Creek mine. 6 saddles, Lynn confirmed. And they want 3 of them with a deeper seat, like the last one. He nodded, a quiet pride in his eyes. The ranch was no longer a place of neglect. The fences were mended, the garden was tilled and ready for spring, and 2 new horses stood in the expanded corral. Life had returned to the quiet homestead, brought in by the steady rhythm of their shared work. That evening, they sat in the main house, a comfortable quiet between them. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the room. Silas was carefully cleaning his medical instruments, while Lynn was mending a bridle, her fingers moving with familiar grace. Her gaze drifted to the wall above the mantelpiece. There, hanging in a place of honor, was one of Sarah's intricate, beautiful quilts, its colors still vibrant. And next to it, mounted with care, was the very first saddle Lynn had brought to him. The one he had bought in Thorne's store, the rawhide and sinew a testament to where they had begun. It was a quiet monument to their partnership, a story told in stitches of thread and leather. They had found each other not in a moment of grand passion, but in a shared respect for honest, well-made things. In a world that had tried to label and discard them both as a reclusive widower and a poor Chinese widow, they had instead built something new. They had crafted a life together, piece by piece, a sturdy and reliable thing made to last. And it was more than enough. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.